He never wanted to be a headline. David Carter was just a man. A father. A husband boarding a flight like thousands of others that day, expecting nothing more than a smooth journey with his family. But in America, being a black man in the wrong place at the wrong time is enough to turn the ordinary into the unthinkable. It started with a look, a sneer, a few sharp words from a flight attendant who thought no one would care. She miscalculated. What followed was a battle not just for respect but for justice. The CEO of the airline took action. The world took notice. And suddenly, David Carter's story was being watched by millions. But when the plane landed, the fight was far from over. Threats followed. The past came roaring into the present. And the question remained, could the truth really win? Or would history rewrite itself once again? Where are you watching from today? Drop your location in the comments. Hit that like button. And subscribe for more powerful stories like this. Now let's begin. It began as any ordinary flight. The kind where people drag their bodies through airport terminals, weighed down by luggage, exhaustion, and the quiet knowledge that they will soon be sealed inside a flying tube where time bends and personal space disappears. David Carter, his wife Elaine, and their two children, Isaiah and Ava, moved carefully down the aisle of the plane, their steps practiced, purposeful. They had traveled before, not often, but enough to know the unspoken rules. Don't take up too much space. Don't draw attention to yourself. And, above all, don't make anyone uncomfortable. David was a man who had learned to navigate spaces that weren't designed for him. He moved with the precision of someone who knew how quickly the air around him could shift. One wrong look, one misplaced gesture, and the mood of a room could turn cold in an instant. Elaine, graceful even in the cramped aisles, guided their children to their assigned seats. Isaiah, 11 and observant, climbed into the window seat, while Ava, only 6, swung her legs as she waited for takeoff. They were excited, unaware of the weight their parents carried, of the silent calculations being made. David adjusted his watch. Elaine reached for a book in her bag. The flight was on time. For now, everything was in order. Then she arrived. Ms. Thornton. The flight attendant moved through the aisle with the confidence of someone who believed herself to be in complete control. She was not rushed, not harried. There was something else in the way she scanned the rows, something sharp, something deliberate. Her gaze landed on them. It wasn't outright hostility. No, racism never announces itself that loudly in places like these. It moves quietly, disguised as something else, an extended glance, a subtle shift in tone, a question that wouldn't have been asked of another passenger. Elaine felt it first, the way the woman's eyes lingered, moving from David's well-worn leather jacket to Isaiah's sneakers, scuffed at the toes from months of playground battles. David exhaled. He knew better than to engage. Let it go. But then, Ms. Thornton smiled. It was not the kind of smile that welcomed. It was the kind that warned. You folks all set? She asked. Her voice tight, clipped. Elaine nodded, but the woman did not move. This your first time flying? A pause. David turned slowly. Excuse me? I just mean, the woman laughed. But the sound was hollow. Performative. You looked a little lost getting to your seats. That's all. The words landed like a stone in the pit of David's stomach. They had not fumbled to find their seats. They had not hesitated. They had moved with the same certainty as every other passenger. This was not about their ability to navigate a plane. Elaine stiffened. She was holding her breath. David knew what she was thinking. Don't start something. Not here. Not in front of the kids. So he did what he had been trained to do. He smiled. Slow and measured. We're fine, thanks. Ms. Thornton held his gaze for a beat longer than necessary before turning on her heel and disappearing down the aisle. Elaine let out a breath. Did you hear that? David's jaw tensed. Yeah. Isaiah, quiet until now, glanced between them. What did she mean? David looked at his son, his beautiful, sharp-minded son who had not yet learned how to pretend these moments didn't exist. She was just asking a question, David said, but the lie tasted bitter. Isaiah was too smart for that. The first cut is always subtle. A look that lingers too long. A tone just sharp enough to draw blood but not loud enough to demand a response. But the thing about small cuts is that they don't stay small. They fester. And this was far from over. The plane filled quickly. The hum of last-minute passengers jostling for overhead space blending with the static-laden announcements from the cockpit. David tried to settle in. to ignore the unease still clinging to his ribs. But Ms. Thornton wasn't finished. She passed by again, this time moving slower, watching. Then, just loud enough for Elaine to hear, she muttered, "Didn't know we started offering discounts for." She let the sentence hang. The words did not need to be completed to be understood. Elaine's back went rigid. David's pulse kicked up, but he forced himself to breathe, to stay still. Ava, still swinging her small legs, was blissfully unaware, but Isaiah was not. His head snapped up. "Mom?" Elaine gritted her teeth. "It's fine, baby. Just get comfortable." But it was not fine. David turned in his seat, locking eyes with Ms. Thornton. His voice was low, controlled. "I'm sorry, did you say something?" Ms. Thornton blinked, feigning innocence. "Oh, nothing. Just making conversation." She walked away, leaving the words hanging between them like a storm cloud. Elaine turned to David. Her hands were shaking. "You heard that?" David nodded. "I heard." Their options were clear. Ignore it. Call her out. But calling her out meant escalation. And escalation, in a place like this, could mean something far worse than discomfort. David had seen it happen before. A black man raising his voice in public was not seen as a man defending his family. It was seen as a threat. He could already hear the headlines forming in the minds of those who weren't paying close enough attention. Unruly passenger causes disturbance on flight. Aggressive man removed from plane after confrontation. It wouldn't matter what had been said to provoke it. Elaine reached for his hand. "Let it go." David clenched his jaw, inhaled, not for the first time. He swallowed the fire. But the thing about fire is it does not stay buried. The shift. People had heard. A man 2 rows back frowned, looking between David and Ms. Thornton. A woman across the aisle narrowed her eyes, her fingers tightening around the armrest. The discomfort spread like ink in water. People who had spent their whole lives avoiding confrontation were now being forced to reckon with something they could not pretend they hadn't witnessed. And somewhere, a young man had just pulled out his phone. A red recording light blinked. The tension thickened. The air in the cabin changed. David felt it shift, a weight pressing down. A moment teetering on the edge of something irreversible. And then, the intercom crackled. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We ask that all passengers remain seated as we handle an issue in the cabin." The murmurs rose. Elaine's grip on David's hand tightened. What does that mean? David didn't know. But he knew this. The next few minutes would change everything. And high above the world, in a space that should have been neutral, the walls were beginning to close in. The air in the cabin had changed. It was no longer the usual mix of recycled oxygen and exhaustion, of overpriced airport coffee and too tight seatbelts. No, this was different. This was the thick, invisible weight of tension. Of words that had been spoken but not yet acknowledged. Of people who had heard but had not yet decided if they would care. David Carter sat rigid in his seat. His jaw clenched so tightly he could feel the pulse beating in his temple. Across from him, Elaine's grip on his hand was tight, her knuckles white against the soft brown of her skin. Isaiah had stopped fidgeting. Ava had stopped swinging her feet. And somewhere, a phone was still recording. The intercom crackled again. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We ask that all passengers remain seated as we handle an issue in the cabin." A pause. A hesitation. Then, "Flight attendants, please report to the front." There it was. The shift. A moment that had been creeping toward inevitability had finally arrived. Ms. Thornton knew it, too. David watched as she stiffened. Her face an unreadable mask. She had played this game before. She had the kind of confidence that came from knowing the world was usually on her side. And why wouldn't it be? She was the authority here. She was the uniform, the badge, the one with the power to call security. To have people removed. To ensure that she walked away unscathed while someone like David was left explaining why he had been the one labeled aggressive. She turned, smoothing down the front of her neatly pressed blouse, and walked toward the front of the cabin. Passengers shifted uncomfortably. A few exchanged glances, but most did what people have always done in moments like this. They looked away. David had seen this before. Not here, not on a plane, but everywhere else. At the grocery store, when the cashier hesitated to take his money, double-checking the bills as though they might be counterfeit. At the bank, when a loan officer smiled thinly and said, "Unfortunately, we can't approve you at this time," despite his spotless credit. At his own job, when his ideas were repeated word for word by a white colleague, only to be met with enthusiastic nods. He had seen it before. And he had learned, early on, that calling it out rarely made it better. But now, people had heard. Now, people had recorded. And now, even the captain of the plane was paying attention. The first voice to rise belonged to a woman in the row behind him. I don't know what that flight attendant's problem is. But that wasn't okay. Heads turned. David glanced over his shoulder. The woman was in her 60s. Her white hair cropped short. Her eyes sharp behind a pair of thin-framed glasses. Her voice was steady, clear. She was not afraid to be heard. The man next to her, younger, maybe in his 40s, nodded. I saw it too. She was out of line. A few more murmurs rippled through the cabin. The tension was shifting again, no longer just resting on David's shoulders, but spreading, stretching, becoming something bigger than just one family's humiliation. For the first time since this started, David felt something other than rage. He felt possibility. Then, Ms. Thornton returned, and suddenly, everything moved too fast. She walked with forced confidence, her eyes darting toward the front of the plane, where another flight attendant stood beside the cockpit door. David didn't know what had been set up there, but he knew that whatever was happening behind the scenes wasn't going the way Ms. Thornton had expected. She stopped beside his row. You've been making some passengers uncomfortable, she said, her voice clipped. I need you to lower your voice and remain seated for the rest of the flight. David blinked. His voice. The woman behind him scoffed. Oh, you have got to be kidding me. Elaine's breath caught in her throat. He hasn't done anything. Ms. Thornton didn't look at her. Her eyes remained locked on David, as if she was willing him to break, to raise his voice, to give her the excuse she needed to push this further. David inhaled. Slow. Then, he spoke, not loud, not angry, but deliberate. You're not going to turn this around on me. A few seats over, the young man with the phone was still recording. Ms. Thornton faltered just for a second but recovered quickly. I'm simply asking for your cooperation, she said, her voice dripping with forced patience. David held her gaze. I think, he said, you're realizing you made a mistake. The silence that followed was different from the ones before. This one was heavy. This one was waiting. Then, a new voice, one that cut through the air like a blade. Excuse me, ma'am. David turned. So did Ms. Thornton. And there, standing at the front of the cabin, dressed in a tailored navy suit, was a man who did not belong in coach. A man with an expression that said he was done watching. A man whose presence shifted everything. My name is Marcus Ellison, he said. There was a beat of silence. Then, I'm the CEO of this airline. The entire plane went still. Ms. Thornton's face drained of color. And just like that, the power in the room shifted. David didn't move. Elaine's hand was still gripping his. But now for the first time it was in quiet reassurance. Ms. Thornton opened her mouth. Closed it. Marcus Ellison stepped forward, his voice calm, unshaken. I've seen the video, he said. I've heard the complaints from passengers. He looked directly at Ms. Thornton. This behavior is unacceptable. Her throat bobbed. Sir, But Marcus Ellison held up a hand. And for the first time since this all began, she fell silent. David watched, feeling something unfamiliar bloom in his chest. Was this justice? Marcus turned toward David and Elaine. I want to personally apologize for what has happened on this flight, he said. David nodded, but said nothing. He didn't need to, because this fight was no longer just his to carry. And for the first time in a long time, he wasn't sure how to feel about that. The silence that followed was a living thing. It stretched across the cabin, thick and unyielding, pressing against every pair of ears, every watching eye, every hand gripping the edges of armrests. David Carter sat still, his breath even, but inside him, something crackled, something old and tired but still burning. For years, he had learned how to navigate these moments, how to make himself smaller when the world demanded it, how to fold his anger into something palatable, something non-threatening, something white folks could swallow without choking. But now, the weight of it was not his alone. Now, the eyes weren't just on him. They were on her. Ms. Thornton. She stood frozen, a woman who had spent her life believing herself untouchable, suddenly faced with the realization that someone was holding her accountable. And not just anyone. The CEO of the airline. Marcus Ellison stood at the front of the cabin. his face calm, unreadable. "I've seen the video," he had said. His voice had been quiet, but it had been final. "Now," Ms. Thornton swallowed, her lips parting, her hands flexing at her sides as she tried to pull herself together. "Sir, Marcus Ellison did not blink. "I would advise you to stop talking." Her mouth snapped shut. A murmur rippled through the passengers. Someone let out a low whistle. A few exchanged glances, half disbelief, half satisfaction. David remained still. He had seen justice before, but never this fast, never this clean. Ms. Thornton turned, looking for an exit that did not exist. A person like her, someone who had spent their life assuming authority, assuming control, did not know how to be cornered. But she was. David saw the calculations flickering behind her eyes, the way she flicked her gaze toward the nearest flight attendant for support. But the young woman standing by the galley, a blonde girl no older than 25, did not meet her eyes. Ms. Thornton was alone, and she knew it. "I was just enforcing policy." She tried again, her voice weaker this time. Marcus tilted his head. "What policy is that?" She hesitated. David almost felt sorry for her. Almost. Marcus did not move, did not shift, did not grant her the space to wiggle out of this. "Because I've read our policies," he continued, voice still measured. "And nowhere does it say that flight attendants are allowed to belittle passengers. Nowhere does it say that a family that has paid for their seats should be treated with anything less than respect." Ms. Thornton's jaw tightened. It was just a misunderstanding. David let out a slow, steady breath. There it was. Misunderstanding. The word that had been weaponized for centuries. The bruises were a misunderstanding. The job rejection was a misunderstanding. The police pulling you over for nothing was a misunderstanding. The way the world tried to shrink you, erase you, remind you where you stood *, always a misunderstanding. Elaine's hand clenched in his. She was waiting to see if this would be another moment where the powerful protected their own. Waiting to see if, yet again, the world would choose to pretend nothing had happened. But Marcus Ellison had already made his choice. "This is not a misunderstanding," he said, and then the words that would end it. "You're fired." The reaction was immediate. A gasp, a sharp intake of breath from the rows behind them. Someone muttered, "Damn." Ms. Thornton flinched as if she had been struck. "Wait." Marcus did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "I will not have my airline represented by someone who treats passengers like this." His gaze did not waver. "You will gather your things. And when this plane lands, you will leave." A beat of silence. Then, Ms. Thornton's face twisted anger and disbelief. A woman who had built her world on certainty, watching it collapse around her. "You can't just." "I already have." The finality of it rang through the cabin. And then, for the first time since this flight began, David breathed freely. But it was not over. Because when power shifts, when the world realigns itself in ways unexpected, there is always resistance. Ms. Thornton was trembling now. Her fists clenched at her sides. Her breathing uneven. "I've given this company 15 years. She spat. Marcus remained impassive. "Then you should have learned something in that time." Her nostrils flared. And then, she did something David did not expect. She turned, and she looked at him. Not at Marcus. Not at the passengers watching her downfall unfold. Him. And suddenly, he knew. She blamed him. Because it was never about what she had done. It was about the fact that someone had dared to hold her accountable. A black man, no less. David met her gaze, unflinching. She opened her mouth, maybe to curse him. Maybe to spit out some last shred of her dignity. Maybe to say the one word she hadn't dared to say aloud this entire flight. But she didn't get the chance. Because from the back of the plane, someone clapped. And then another. And then another. Until the sound of it was deafening. Ms. Thornton recoiled, her face flushed with humiliation. She turned sharply, storming toward the front of the plane, disappearing behind the curtain to first class. The clapping died down, but the energy remained, something shifting, something settling. And then, Marcus turned back to David. "For what it's worth," he said, his voice softer now. "I'm sorry this happened." David nodded. "I appreciate that." Marcus hesitated. "You ever flown with us before?" "Once or twice." Marcus smiled, but there was something behind it, something sharper, something tired. "Well," he said, "I hope you do again." David studied him, this man who had power, who had used it in a way that David had never seen before. And then, finally, he smiled back. "We'll see." The flight continued. Ms. Thornton did not return. David sat back in his seat, feeling the tension drain from his shoulders. Elaine exhaled, squeezing his hand. Isaiah, wide-eyed, whispered, "Dad, did we win?" David glanced at him. And then, with a quiet certainty, he said, "For today." But the world was still watching. And somewhere, in the glow of 1,000 phone screens, the conversation had already begun. Because this was not just about one flight. It never was. The clapping had faded, but the weight of what had happened lingered in the cabin, thick as the recirculated air pressing against every seat, every body, every unspoken thought. David Carter sat still, his mind racing even as his hands lay motionless in his lap. He should have felt relieved, should have felt victorious. But instead, he felt something colder, something unfinished. Because power, real power, never surrenders easily. And Miss Thornton had not left that aisle as a woman ashamed. She had left as a woman waiting for her moment to strike back. The passengers around him murmured in quiet tones, some leaning toward each other in whispered conversations, others still staring at their phones, where footage of the confrontation was likely spreading, bit by bit, beyond the confines of this metal vessel. Elaine exhaled sharply beside him. "I still don't believe it," she murmured, shaking her head. David turned to her. "Believe what?" "That it happened. That he actually fired her." David studied his wife's face, the way her eyebrows were still furrowed, the way her fingers had not yet unclenched from the tension of it all. Because she knew, too, that this moment, however rare, however fleeting, was not the end of it. Not here, not in America. And then, it happened. The curtain at the front of the plane snapped open. A second flight attendant, a man this time, taller, older, his uniform crisp, his expression unreadable, walked down the aisle. Slow, deliberate. David knew before the man even reached them. Knew before he even spoke. Because there was something about the air now. Something colder. Something closing in. The balance of power was shifting again. The man stopped at their row, glancing down at David, at Elaine, at their children. "Sir," he said, voice level, rehearsed, corporate. David's fingers curled into his jeans. "We're going to need you to step to the front of the plane." Elaine's head snapped up. "For what?" The attendant barely glanced at her. "We just need to have a quick word." A quick word. David had heard that before, too. In a boardroom where his ideas were questioned with a polite smile. In a department store, when a security guard had trailed him too closely. In a restaurant, when the check came earlier than expected, despite his table being the last to order. A quick word meant trouble. It meant that Ms. Thornton had not gone down quietly. It meant that somewhere, in a place David could not see, strings had been pulled. The murmurs in the cabin grew. Passengers were watching again, waiting. David could feel Isaiah tense beside him. Could feel the way Elaine's hand found his arm. As if she knew that whatever came next would not be fair. He glanced at Marcus Ellison, still seated in first class, still watching. The CEO's jaw was tight. His fingers tapped once against the armrest. A subtle movement, a silent warning. Something is happening behind the scenes. David breathed in, then out. He had choices. Refuse. Demand answers. Get up. See where this led. He chose the second. He always had. The aisle felt longer than before. Every step toward the front of the plane was measured. Deliberate. But inside, the fire was growing again. Because he knew this game. Knew that racism never liked to be confronted. Never liked to be made to answer for itself. No, it preferred to flip the script. To turn the accused into the aggressor. To make the victim the villain. And that was what this was. An attempt to remind him, despite what had just happened, that power did not belong to him. Not really. Not yet. He was led past the first-class section, through the small door that separated the galley from the cockpit, where two more attendants stood waiting. One of them was already on the phone, speaking in hushed tones. Miss Thornton was nowhere in sight, but her absence was louder than her presence. David crossed his arms. "What's this about?" The taller flight attendant, the one who had called him forward, folded his hands. "We've been informed that there was an altercation." David felt the heat rising in his chest. There was no altercation. The attendant nodded, as if he had expected that answer. "Be that as it may. Sir, we need to assess whether this flight can continue safely." A slow blink. A long breath. David leaned forward. Just enough. You think I'm a threat? There it was. The words they hadn't wanted him to say out loud. The question they didn't want to answer. And yet, in the shifting glances, in the stiffness of their shoulders, in the way one of them cleared their throat but didn't deny it outright. There it was. He had called it, long before Ms. Thornton had even opened her mouth. A black man raising his voice in public was not seen as a man defending his family. It was seen as a danger. It was a justification, a reason to remove him, to flip the story, to make sure that when this flight landed, when the headlines were written, the world would not see a father protecting his children. They would see a man who had caused a disturbance. And David Carter refused to let that happen. He straightened. I suggest, he said slowly, carefully, because this was the moment where everything could turn, where one wrong word, one wrong movement could cost him everything. I suggest you check the recording that half this plane has on their phones. A pause. Because if you're looking for a disturbance, you might want to start with your former employee. Another silence. And then, from the open curtain behind him, I can confirm that. David turned. Marcus Ellison stood there. The CEO stepped forward, his presence cutting through the tension like a knife through silk. Mr. Carter is not a threat, he said, his voice even, his eyes sharp, but I suggest you be very careful about treating him like one. David exhaled, slow, and just like that, the balance shifted again. The attendants hesitated, glancing between each other, the authority they had assumed just moments ago now slipping through their fingers. Marcus turned to David. Go back to your seat, he said, not an order, a statement, a quiet permission. David nodded, and as he walked back through the aisle, back toward his family, the murmurs in the cabin swelled this time. Not just whispers of curiosity. This time, they were voices of approval. Because everyone had seen. And this time, the story was not going to be rewritten. Elaine's hand was back in his the moment he sat down. Isaiah's eyes were still wide. Ava, still too young to fully understand, simply leaned against her mother's side, sensing the shift in the air. David exhaled. Elaine whispered, "You okay?" He nodded once, but deep inside, he knew this was not over, because the world did not change in a day. And this, however satisfying, was only the beginning. The hum of the cabin had changed. No longer just the quiet murmuring of passengers, the occasional shuffle of feet, the metallic rattle of beverage carts. It was something heavier now. David Carter could feel it pressing against his back, settling into the space between him and his wife, between his son's questioning gaze and the aisle where, just minutes ago, his presence alone had been called into question. He had made it back to his seat. But the battle was not over. Not yet. The plane began its descent. And with it came the shift, the moment when the world outside, the one waiting beyond these pressurized walls, began creeping back into focus. David clenched his fists, staring out the window. Below, the city stretched wide, blinking and alive, unaware that up here, above its rooftops, a war had been waged. Unaware that a black man, seated in coach, had nearly been labeled a disturbance simply for existing in a space that others believed he should shrink inside of. But David knew the truth. The real fight would not happen in this plane. It would happen the moment they landed. Elaine sensed it too. She had not let go of his hand, even as the kids fidgeted beside her, even as the captain's voice came over the intercom with landing instructions. Her fingers, usually soft, were pressing into his palm, not out of fear, out of readiness. Because if there was one thing they both knew, it was this: racism does not like to lose. Not publicly, not like this. No, when it is embarrassed, when it is forced into retreat, it does not disappear. It waits. It finds another way. And David could feel it coming. The first sign was the officer waiting at the gate. The plane touched down smoothly, the wheels skidding slightly against the runway. And as they taxied to the terminal, David allowed himself one deep, steadying breath. For the first time in hours, he thought, maybe just maybe he could let go of the tension gripping his spine. Then he saw the uniform. And he knew. Elaine saw it too. Her breath hitched. David, I see him. Isaiah followed his father's gaze. His voice was small, but not afraid, confused. Why are the police here? David felt the heat rising in his chest again. Not anger. Anticipation. He did not answer his son. Because there was no way to say it without laying another stone on the weight that boy would have to carry for the rest of his life. The passengers began gathering their things. The usual shuffle, the stretching, the rustling of jackets. But this time, there was an awareness to it. Because everyone had seen. And everyone was waiting to see what would happen next. David could feel them watching. Some in sympathy, some in curiosity, and some, perhaps, waiting for proof that the world still worked exactly the way they expected it to. The expectation that men like him black men who stood their ground were always met with consequence. The officer stepped forward just as Marcus Ellison did. David barely had time to react before the CEO was moving ahead of him. His crisp navy suit a stark contrast to the black and blue uniform of the man standing in his path. "Can I help you, officer?" Marcus's voice was smooth, unreadable, but sharp. The officer, a stocky man with a badge that glinted under the airport fluorescence, squared his shoulders. "I was informed of a passenger disturbance on this flight." Marcus did not blink. "Who informed you?" A hesitation. And that was all the answer David needed. Elaine's grip tightened. David exhaled through his nose. He would not raise his voice. He didn't need to. "Are you here for me?" he asked. His tone even, controlled. The officer's gaze flickered. He was expecting anger, defensiveness. He got neither. Instead, he got a man who had already beaten him to the truth. "I'm just following protocol, sir," the officer muttered, but the confidence in his voice was slipping. David tilted his head. "Whose protocol?" The murmurs began again. Passengers stopped walking. Some pulled out their phones. Marcus Ellison took a single step forward, closing the space between himself and the officer. And for a moment, just a moment, the balance of power shifted again. "I am the CEO of this airline," Marcus said, voice like steel wrapped in silk. "And I can assure you, officer, that the only disturbance on this flight was the behavior of one of my former employees." Another hesitation. Then, from behind the officer, a voice David had expected but had not wanted to hear again. "Ms. Thornton." She stepped forward, her face carefully composed, but her eyes sharp with quiet victory. "I reported the incident," she said smoothly, "for the safety of the crew and passengers." David's jaw flexed. Of course, she had found another way. The officer, uncertain now, glanced between her and Marcus. David watched as Ms. Thornton lifted her chin slightly, as if daring him to challenge her in front of the law. Because she was still playing the game. Still betting on the same old story. She was banking on history. On the fact that a uniform no matter how undeserved could still outweigh the truth. And maybe, on another day, in another place, she would have been right. But not today. Because Marcus Ellison stepped forward again. And this time, his voice was not calm. "This man," he said, turning to David, "was the victim of an unjust, racist incident on my airline." The officer blinked. "Sir, you will not be escorting him anywhere," Marcus continued, voice rising just enough for the surrounding passengers to hear. "In fact, officer, if you are truly concerned about justice, I suggest you escort someone else." He turned, eyes locking on Ms. Thornton. And just like that, the script was rewritten. The officer hesitated. Passengers murmured louder now, some outright whispering to each other, some shaking their heads. Ms. Thornton's lips parted, but this time, she had no words. She had lost before she had even begun. Because the moment Marcus Ellison spoke, the moment a man in power a man in a suit who did not look like David but stood beside him anyway had chosen to stand on the right side of history. The world had been forced to listen. The officer exhaled through his nose. Finally, reluctantly, he stepped back. "No further action will be taken," he muttered. He turned to Ms. Thornton. "You need to leave the premises." Her face drained of color. For the first time since this began, she had no more moves to play. David turned, feeling Elaine's eyes on him, feeling the weight of Isaiah's stare. "Dad?" David exhaled. And this time, for the first time since this flight began, he smiled. "We're going home, son." And as he walked toward baggage claim, toward the world waiting beyond the airport doors, he knew this was only the beginning. Because real justice had finally taken flight. The airport doors slid open, and the world rushed in. David Carter stepped forward, his shoulders still tight with the weight of what had just happened. But the air outside was different. It was free. It carried the smell of pavement after a long day's heat, the sound of taxi horns, the rush of people moving forward. For the first time in hours, he was no longer trapped. But the real fight was just beginning. Elaine walked beside him, her grip on his arm still firm, as though she was afraid that at any moment, another officer, another authority figure, might materialize out of thin air and demand that he answer for something he hadn't done. Their children followed close. Isaiah was quiet, his face unreadable, but David saw it. He saw the way his son's mind was turning, taking this all in, storing it away, a lesson he should not have had to learn so soon. Ava, young enough to miss the full weight of what had happened, simply tugged at her mother's sleeve. Are we going to the hotel now? Elaine smiled at her, soft but tired. Yeah, baby, we're going. But they weren't even out of the airport yet. Because something else was waiting. It began with a single camera flash. Then another. Then the voices. Mr. Carter, can we get a statement? Sir, did you feel threatened by the flight crew? Mr. Carter, what do you want to say to the airline? The press. The moment the plane had landed, the story had already left the confines of that cabin, spilled out into the waiting world where stories like his were both sensational and familiar. It was already on the news. And the cameras were here. Waiting. David tensed. He had not wanted this. He had not wanted to be a headline, a trending topic, a symbol. He had wanted to take his family on vacation. He had wanted to exist. And yet, here he was standing beneath the cold glare of flashing lights, with microphones angled toward his face like knives, as though his very presence needed to be explained. Marcus Ellison appeared beside him, as calm and composed as ever. Do you want to speak? The CEO asked, his voice low enough that only David could hear. David glanced at Elaine. He saw the exhaustion in her eyes. He saw the warning. Be careful, because when the world decides to listen, it does not always hear what you meant to say. He turned to the reporters. He chose his words. I'm not here to talk about airlines, he said, his voice steady but firm. I'm here to talk about something that's been happening long before I ever stepped on that plane. A hush. The cameras kept rolling. David exhaled, and then he let the truth fall freely. This is not about one flight attendant. This is not about one airline. This is about the way we are treated everywhere. Every day. A murmur rippled through the crowd. David looked into the cameras, as if he were speaking to the people on the other side of the screens. The ones watching from their living rooms, their offices, their phones. The ones who had been here before. The ones who knew. You ask if I felt threatened. He continued, but I'll ask you, why does a black man, defending himself, automatically get labeled as a disturbance? A beat of silence. Then the world started listening. The next 24 hours moved like wildfire. Footage of the incident of Ms. Thornton's smirk, of David's refusal to shrink, of Marcus Ellison's sharp, public firing spread across news channels, social media feeds, op-ed columns. People had opinions. Some hailed it as a rare moment of justice. Others called it an overreaction. She was just doing her job. This is why people shouldn't record everything. Maybe he was being disruptive. David had expected this. He knew how quickly the narrative could be rewritten. But what he had not expected, what he had never dared to believe, was how many people refused to let that happen. Because this time, the world was paying attention. Strangers reached out. Some shared their own stories of being watched too closely in stores, of being denied service for no reason, of being followed, questioned, made to feel like they did not belong in their own country. Marcus Ellison released a public statement condemning the treatment of passengers on his airline, promising an internal review, a company-wide reckoning. Ms. Thornton, in her own desperate attempt at control, gave an interview claiming that she had been set up. David only watched a few seconds of it before turning it off. Because it didn't matter. Not anymore. That night, in the quiet of their hotel room, David sat by the window, staring at the city beyond. Elaine curled up beside him, resting her head on his shoulder. Isaiah and Ava were already asleep. You okay? Elaine murmured. David exhaled. I don't know. Elaine didn't press. Because she knew. This fight, the one that had started long before they boarded that plane, was not over. And it never would be. Not really. But something was different now. A crack had formed in the foundation. Maybe it wasn't enough to bring the whole thing down. But it was a start. And sometimes, a start was all you needed. The morning after, The world had changed. At least, that was what people wanted to believe. David Carter knew better. He had seen moments like this before, moments where the world gasped at its own reflection. Where America was briefly forced to look at itself in the mirror. The country had a way of doing this, of pretending it had just discovered the weight of its sins, as if the bruises it left behind weren't still fresh on the bodies of those who had lived beneath its boot. But David also knew something else. This was different. Not because justice had been served, not because the system had miraculously worked for once, but because people had been watching, and they had refused to look away. Elaine was still asleep beside him. Her breath was slow, steady, but David could feel the exhaustion wrapped around her. It was the kind of exhaustion that had nothing to do with sleep. He turned, careful not to wake her, and sat up in bed. His phone was buzzing. Again, the screen lit up with unread messages. Missed calls. Notifications stacked on top of each other like bricks in a wall. His name asterisk, his face asterisk was everywhere. A headline scrolled across the newsfeed. Flight discrimination incident sparks national debate. Another read. Passenger speaks out. Why does defending yourself make you a threat? And then there were the messages. Some from strangers. Some from old friends he hadn't spoken to in years. Some were filled with solidarity, words of encouragement. People saying, "I see you. I hear you." Others were not so kind. He had expected the backlash. It came the way it always did, like a sickness. Spreading through comment sections, through anonymous emails, through whispers disguised as conversations. He's making a big deal out of nothing. This is why people don't trust the media. Maybe if he had just kept his mouth shut, none of this would have happened. Another angry black man playing the victim. David exhaled, steadying himself. None of it surprised him. Because America does not like to be confronted with its own reflection. And when it is, it fights back. The first real threat came that afternoon. Elaine had taken the kids down to the hotel pool, trying to carve out some sense of normalcy, trying to remind them that they were still on vacation, even if the world had other plans. David stayed behind, scrolling through the messages, deleting what needed to be deleted. Then, an email. Subject line. You should watch your back. David stared at it for a long time before opening it. It wasn't long, just a few sentences. Men like you always think you've won. But you haven't. You just made yourself a target. His fingers tightened around the phone. He had seen threats like this before. Had watched them destroy people. Force them into hiding. Make them question whether speaking out had been worth it. But the truth was, he was afraid. Not for himself. For his family. Elaine knew something was wrong the moment she walked back into the room. She had always known how to read him, how to see through the quiet. Through the restraint. Through the way he swallowed things whole rather than let them spill onto the people he loved. She set her bag down carefully, tilting her head. What happened? David hesitated. Then, he handed her the phone. Elaine's eyes scanned the screen. And for a moment, she didn't move. Then, slowly, she exhaled. They're scared, she said. Her voice was steady, but her hands trembled. David nodded. Yeah, he murmured. They are. But fear does not always come in retreat. Sometimes, it comes in violence. The hotel had been discreet when they reached out. A call from the front desk. A polite, almost embarrassed tone. Mr. Carter, we just wanted to let you know, there have been some calls. People asking if you're staying here. A pause. We've taken precautions, of course. But we thought you should be aware. David thanked them, ended the call, then sat still for a long time. Elaine watched him. She knew the conversation playing out in his head. She had married a man who was always calculating risk. But this was different. This isn't over, she said quietly. David shook his head. No, he murmured. It's not. He thought about what came next. The interviews. The calls from news stations asking him to appear on live television. The lawyers who had already begun reaching out. Some promising justice. Others promising wealth, each one trying to turn this moment into something for themselves. The politicians. Suddenly eager to use his story as a talking point. As if his existence had only become relevant when it could serve them. David wanted no part of it. But he also knew this was bigger than him now. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the city in a deep, burning gold, David sat beside his son, watching the lights flicker on in the buildings beyond their hotel window. Isaiah was quiet for a long time. Then, finally, Dad? David turned to him, His son looked up, searching his father's face as if trying to make sense of the weight in the room. Are we in danger? The question was a blade. David took a slow breath. Then, carefully honestly he answered. Some people want us to be. Isaiah's small hands curled into his lap. Because you didn't let them win? David met his son's gaze. His heart heavy, his throat tight. And then, quietly, because they're afraid of what happens when we do. The world was still watching. And David Carter was not done speaking. The night was long. David Carter sat awake in the dim glow of the hotel room, listening to the quiet rhythm of his family's breathing. Elaine had fallen asleep with Ava curled up beside her. Their bodies tangled in that way mothers and daughters sometimes do, as if the world outside could not touch them if they just held onto each other tightly enough. Isaiah was restless. He shifted in the bed next to David, caught somewhere between sleep and the echoes of the day. David, too, was restless, because the world was still moving, still shifting beneath them, and he could feel the weight of what was coming. The phone vibrated again. Another news outlet, another request for an interview. They wanted him on the morning show. Wanted him to sit across from some well-dressed anchor and tell the country what it already knew but pretended it was hearing for the first time. That racism was alive and well. That it was not some distant ghost of the past. Not some relic buried in history books but something alive. Breathing, sitting next to you on a plane, serving you in a restaurant, deciding in real time whether or not you were worthy of dignity. David let the call go to voicemail. He already knew what he would say if he accepted. But what he did not know, what no one ever knew, was what would come after. Because history had taught him one thing above all else. Truth has a cost. And sometimes, the people who told it were the first to be buried beneath it. The next morning, the world came knocking. It started small, a few reporters outside the hotel, standing stiffly in their pressed suits, waiting for a quote, a comment, a sound bite to fill the morning headlines. Then came the larger crowds. People who had seen the video. Some who came to shake his hand, to tell him they were with him, that he was brave. As if bravery was something he had chosen, instead of something that had been forced upon him. But there were others, too. The ones who watched from across the street. The ones whose faces were set in tight, unreadable lines. The ones who whispered among themselves, hands in pockets, waiting. Elaine saw them before he did. She touched his arm lightly as they stepped outside. We shouldn't stay here much longer. David nodded. He knew she was right. The temperature was rising, not just in the air, but in the way people were looking at him now. Some with admiration, some with resentment, and some with something else entirely. Then, the first bottle was thrown. Glass shattered against the pavement a few feet away. A murmur rippled through the crowd, shifting from murmurs to movement. A hotel security guard stepped forward. But too late, the second bottle flew. This time, it landed closer. A woman gasped. Someone yelled. And just like that, the air was different. The murmurs turned into something sharper. Something dangerous. David felt Elaine's grip tighten. He turned to Isaiah, who was watching, wide-eyed, taking it all in. Inside, David said firmly, "But Dad." Now, Elaine didn't argue. She grabbed Ava, guiding both children back into the hotel lobby. David stayed outside, because he had learned a long time ago that running does not make the world kinder. It only makes it chase you harder. A voice cut through the noise. "You think you're a hero?" David turned. A man mid-50s, red in the face, standing near the edge of the gathering. "You think you did something?" the man sneered. David had seen men like him before. Men who had spent their entire lives believing that the world belonged to them. That it was theirs by birthright. That anything outside of their control was a threat. Men who were not used to losing. David did not flinch. "I didn't do anything," he said evenly. "I just told the truth." The man laughed, sharp and humorless. "That's the problem," he spat. "You people always think the truth matters." And there it was. The thing no one ever says out loud. The crowd shifted again. A few people stepped back. A few stepped forward. Someone started recording. David squared his shoulders. Because this was the moment. The moment where the story could turn. Where one wrong word, one wrong move, could flip the entire narrative. It had happened before. A black man stands his ground and suddenly, he's the aggressor. A flight attendant insults a passenger and somehow, it's the passenger who's causing a disturbance. History was always waiting to rewrite itself. And David refused to let it. So he spoke. Not loudly. Not with anger. But with a quiet, unshakable truth. You're afraid. The man scoffed. Of what? David exhaled. Slow. That people like me won't stay quiet anymore. The man's face twisted, his hands flexing at his sides. But he had nothing to say. Because he knew it was true. And so did everyone watching. By the time the police arrived, the crowd had swelled. It was no longer just a handful of people. It was something bigger. Something unignorable. And that was what made them nervous. Because this was no longer just about a man on a flight. It was about something deeper. Something they could not control. David knew then that he had a choice. He could walk away. He could let this moment pass. Let the story fade into the next headline. The next news cycle. The next fleeting outrage. Or he could make them remember. He could make sure that this time, the world did not look away. And so, he stepped forward. Past the murmuring crowd. Past the cameras. Past the people who were still waiting to see what he would do. He looked into the nearest lens, looked straight at the world watching from the other side. And then, clearly without hesitation, he spoke. You can throw your bottles. You can send your threats. You can try to scare us into silence. A beat of silence. Then, but we are still here. And just like that, the reckoning began.